It was supposed to be just another cowardly attack. 6 armed men, leather jackets, arrogant smiles. They stormed into the small grocery store in the heart of Fairview, kicking over shelves, smashing bottles, ripping money from the cash register. Evelyn Carter watched in silence. A 62-year-old widow, fragile, defenseless. At least that's how they saw her. But as one of the thugs laughed, stomping on a photo of her late husband, an old instinct awakened. Those idiots had just signed their death sentence. Because Evelyn Carter wasn't just a lonely old lady. She had hunted terrorists in the Middle East, dismantled clandestine operations in Russia, and eliminated targets the government wouldn't even admit existed. And now? Now she would hunt those 6 men. One by one, they messed with the wrong woman, and they were about to find that out the hard way.
Hi, here's Mark. Before we begin, please comment about where you're watching from and what you enjoy most about our stories. Oh, and if you haven't subscribed yet, now's the perfect time to do it so you don't miss our next stories. Tomorrow, we have an amazing one waiting for you. Thanks for being here. Now, let's dive into today's story.
Morning in Fairview, Texas gas dawned like any other. The sun rose lazily over the roofs of old houses, casting golden shadows on the main avenue. The warm wind carried the smell of fresh bread from the corner bakery, mixed with the aroma of freshly brewed coffee from the modest Carter's Market, the small grocery store Evelyn Carter had run for over 2 decades. For the locals, that store was more than just a business. It was a meeting point, a refuge where stories were shared among shelves packed with products and faded posters on the walls. For Evelyn, however, that place was much more than a source of income. It was the last link to her deceased husband. The 62-year-old woman moved with the efficiency of someone who knew every inch of the establishment. Her grey hair, tied in a simple bun, and her calm gaze hid a past no one in town could ever imagine. Behind the counter, she rang up the purchases of a regular customer, old Hank Turner, who, as always, complained about the price of milk while adjusting his battered cowboy hat. Evelyn gave a slight smile, responding patiently, maintaining the gentle widow image she had built over the years. But behind that placid demeanor, her senses remained ever alert, just as they had been trained to be in another life, long before she arrived there. It was late that afternoon when Fairview's tranquility was shattered. The first sign came in the form of an engine roaring too loudly for the town standards, a coarse noise echoing down the street like a non-verbal warning. Evelyn looked up just as a black pickup truck abruptly parked in front of the grocery store tailors, kicking up dust and aggressively asserting its presence. 6 men got out, their heavy boots crushing the cigarette butts scattered on the asphalt. Troy, Mad Dog. Mitchell led the group, a man with a hard expression, unkempt beard, giant tattoos scattered across muscular arms. He and his cronies wore worn leather jackets, sporting symbols of a gang Evelyn didn't yet know, but recognized by the smell, the kind of people who acted like the town belonged to them. The door to Carter's Market was violently flung, open, making the bell above it rattle furiously. The once welcoming environment was swallowed by an oppressive presence. Evelyn kept her composure as the men entered, spreading out with predatory looks, heavy hands resting on shelves, knocking over goods on purpose. She didn't react immediately. First, she assessed. Her eyes scanned each of them, noting details, the fight scars on their knuckles, the sharp looks seeking any sign of reaction, the way they moved together, coordinated like wolves circling prey. "Nice little store, Grandma," Troy said, drawing out the words in a tone heavy with irony. The way he looked at her, as if she were just a helpless old lady, lit a spark inside her. Evelyn had seen that look before, on other faces, in other lands. Enemy soldiers underestimated her. Arms traffickers believed she was weak. On missions around the world, men who thought they controlled the situation learned, too late, that they were wrong. But at that moment, she showed nothing. "Can I help you with something?" she asked, her tone meticulously calm. The group laughed, and one of the men, a tall, skinny guy with a gold tooth sparkling under the yellowish light of the store's house, approached the shelves and started sweeping products to the floor with a careless wave of his hand. Cans of beans and packages of pasta fell noisily, scattering across the wooden floor. Evelyn watched, unmoved. "Looks like we don't have the money to pay today," Troy continued, approaching the counter and leaning on it with both hands. He reeked of cheap tobacco and tequila, a smell Evelyn associated with poor decisions and imminent violence. "Depict, Temsi, we can work out a deal. You give us what we want and we won't make an even bigger mess." Evelyn's response came in the form of a look, calm on the outside, calculating on the inside. Without hesitation, she opened the cash drawer and threw a bunch of bills on the counter. The gang laughed again, satisfied with the apparent submission. It was exactly what she wanted them to believe. But then Troy did something that changed everything. He looked around the store and his eyes landed on an old photo hanging on the wall right behind the counter. It was a black and white photograph of Evelyn and her late husband Daniel on the day they opened the store. A moment of genuine happiness, frozen in time. Troy's wicked grin widened. "That your hubby?" he asked, ripping the frame off the wall. The glass cracked under his fingers as he spun it in his hands, studying the image with disdain. "I bet he'd love to see this little store now." Evelyn's heart kept beating at the same pace, but something inside her shifted. It was almost imperceptible, a subtle change in posture, a hidden tension in muscles previously at ease. She recognized the exact moment when a mission changed from assessment to action. Troy threw the photo on the floor and stomped on it, with his boot dusty with dirt. The sound of glass cracking under his weight was the only noise in the store at that moment. Evelyn Carter just smiled. "Take whatever you want and leave," she said, her voice emotionless. The men laughed, again failing to notice the difference in her tone. They grabbed the most expensive items, emptied the cash register, and left one by one. But as they crossed the door, Evelyn had already memorized each face, each outfit, each mannerism. She knew which of them had training, who was just a pawn, who put too much trust in the leader, and who looked around as if searching for a way out. When the black pickup truck disappeared down the dirt road, taking the store's money and a false sense of victory, Evelyn locked the door and let out a long, heavy sigh. It wasn't a sigh of fear or frustration. It was something much more calculated, a controlled release of tension, the first step before the counterattack. She did not clean up the mess immediately. Instead, she walked to the back of the store, where an old cabinet had been locked for years. She took a set of keys, selected the right one, and unlocked the door. Inside, covered by a thin layer of dust, was a metal box marked with a discreet symbol, a seal that few would recognize, but those who did knew what it meant. Evelyn Carter opened the box and stared at its contents. 6 men had made the worst mistake of their lives that night. They messed with the wrong woman. Night fell on Fairview with a heavy silence, the kind of stillness that precedes a storm. The hot Texas air carried the smell of parched earth and gasoline, while the streets of the small town gradually emptied. Inside Carter's market, Evelyn Carter remained motionless, sitting in a rocking chair in the back storage room. The wall clock showed almost midnight, but time meant nothing to her at that moment. Her eyes were fixed on the open metal box on the table, where relics of a forgotten life glinted under the dim lamplight, a coded radio, a Sig Sauer P229 pistol carefully wrapped in velvet cloth, fake documents with names she had used before, objects that seemed to belong to someone else, to a version of herself that should no longer exist. But that night, that version re-emerged from the ashes. Evelyn closed her eyes for a moment, allowing herself to revisit a past she had always tried to bury. Beirut, 1989. Caracas, 1997. Moscow, 2003. Missions under false identities. Operations where information was worth more than human life. She remembered nights spent in temporary safe houses, the weight of a gun at her waist, dried blood on her black gloves. She had been a spy, a highly trained undercover CIA agent, moving through the shadows, eliminating threats before they became problems. Her real name rarely appeared in records, and her legacy was buried under layers of secrecy and misinformation. But now, there in that grocery store that was the last memory of her peaceful life, she knew she could no longer ignore who she was. Not when those 6 men thought they could stomp on her without facing consequences. The attack on the store had not been just a robbery. The precision and brutality of the thugs made it clear it was a test, a warning. But from whom? Troy. Mitchell was nothing more than a low-level criminal, an ex-convict trying to regain his position in the underworld. He couldn't have orchestrated this on his own. Someone bigger was behind him. With a slow sigh, Evelyn picked up a bundle of old papers from the bottom of the box and leafed through them. Among forged passports and notes, scribbled in faded ink at cone, she found something that caught her attention. An old contact, a phone number she hadn't dialed in years, but which now might have the answers she needed. She picked up the landline phone and dialed the numbers precisely. 3 rings. Thursday silence, then a heavy breath on the other end. "It's been a long time," said a grave and aged but still steady voice. Evelyn gave a slight predator's smile. "Frank Delaney, you still breathing?" A muffled laugh came from the other side, loaded with nostalgia and caution. Frank Delaney was more than just a colleague in the CIA. He was a survivor, one of the few agents who learned how to grow old in the game without getting killed or discarded. Unlike her, he never tried a peaceful life. He stayed on the agency's radar, circulating among leaked information, always one step ahead of. Her tone was direct and cold, just as it always was on missions where information meant life or death. "I need a dossier on Troy Mitchell. Everything. Arrests, gang connections, banking activity, anything that tells me where he got the nerve to step on my turf." Frank sighed on the other end, and she could imagine his expression marked by distrust. "That's not like you, Evie. I knew one day you'd go back to this sort of thing, but I thought it would take longer." She ignored the provocation, picking up the pistol and checking the chamber, a long-forgotten habit returning effortlessly. "I'm waiting, Frank." He didn't argue. When Frank Delaney went silent for more than 3 seconds, it meant he was working. She heard the distant sound of keys being pressed, files being searched on obscure servers. Outside, the city slept, but inside Carter's market, Evelyn Carter was no longer just a widow running her store. She was the woman criminals and terrorists had learned to fear decades ago. After a few minutes, Frank came back. "Troy Mitchell isn't operating alone. He's linked to a cartel that's been active in Texas for years, specializing in arms and drugs. But here's the interesting detail. His gang shouldn't be here. They operate farther south, near the border. If he came up to Fairview, just means someone sent him." Evelyn narrowed her eyes, feeling the adrenaline pumping. So that was it. The attack wasn't random. "I need more names, Frank. I need to know who he answers to." The ex-agent took a deep breath. "Evie, I know you've already made your decision, but listen to me. This might be bigger than you think. Are you sure you want to get involved?" She picked up the pistol, feeling the familiar weight in her palm. There was no hesitation, no going back. "They came to me, Frank. Now, I'm going after them." Silence lingered on the line for a long time before Frank finally muttered, resigned, "I'll send you everything I can. If you need backup, let me know. But Evie, be careful. They have no idea who they messed with." Evelyn hung up the phone and stood, the rocker creaking under her weight. The night was just beginning, and she had work to do. The past never dies. It just waits for the right moment to resurface. She barely glimpsed the sunrise over Fairview, the pale orange sky, when Evelyn Carter was already on the move. The city was still asleep, lulled by the illusion of security that comes with small communities. But for her, that morning marked the start of something far bigger. Her instincts, long dormant beneath the routine of a store owner, were fully awakened. While she brewed a cup of strong coffee, her eyes wandered around the small, organized kitchen, but her mind was far from that room. Frank Delaney had not delayed in delivering what he promised. Shortly after 3 in the morning, a digital dossier arrived through a secure channel, revealing everything she needed to know about Troy Mad Dog Mitchell and his connections. The gang he led, known as the Copperheads, was not large by itself, but associated with something much more dangerous, a weapons cartel with ties in Mexico and the southern United States. What caught her attention the most, however, was one specific piece of information. Troy had been released from prison only 2 months before, and since then had been expanding his operations into territories not under his control. That explained why he had attacked Carter's Market. It wasn't just a random robbery. It was a deliberate act to test his hold over the town. He wanted the population to fear the Copperheads, to turn Fairview into a strategic point for illegal operations. But Troy had made a fatal mistake. Evelyn did not take provocations without retaliation. She sat at her small kitchen table and opened her laptop, bringing Frank's report onto the screen. Her eyes scanned the information with the analytical precision of a professional, absorbing every detail. Troy and his men were based in an abandoned junkyard on the outskirts of town, a remote, discreet spot perfect for conducting business away from authorities' eyes. There was also a speakeasy serving as a meeting point for the Copperheads, a place called the Rusty Nail, where criminals exchanged favors, drugs, and information without fear of repercussions. Evelyn closed the laptop and took a deep breath. She already knew where to start. Her old 1985 Chevy Silverado glided down the gravel road leading to the Rusty Nail, its engine humming softly in the still cool morning air. Despite the hour, the bar was already alive. Trucks and motorcycles were parked carelessly out front, some displaying intertwined snake decals, the Copperhead symbol. She stopped her truck at a safe distance, giving herself a few minutes to observe. The entrance to the bar was a rusty iron door, and an old hulk, presumably the bouncer, leaned against the wall smoking a cigarette. He was the kind of man who thought himself intimidating, but Evelyn recognized a dead weight when she saw, 1. He was there not to fight, but to threaten. She got out of the truck and walked slowly toward the bar. Her entire body projected the image of an ordinary woman, calm steps, simple clothes, an innocent expression, but her gaze was always alert, her moves strategically planned. Evelyn had spent years perfecting the art of disguise, and this was just another mission. As she approached the entrance, the bouncer blew smoke and gave her a contemptuous look. "What do we have here?" he said, adjusting the wide belt around his belly. "You lost, Granny. This ain't a place for your kind." Evelyn stopped a few steps from him, raising an eyebrow with a slight smile. Her voice was soft and controlled, but carried a chill that didn't match her appearance. "I'm here to speak with Troy. Tell him the widow from the grocery store came for a visit." The bouncer laughed loudly, a guttural laugh full of derision. He shook his head, clearly amused by the situation. "You got guts, huh? But I don't think he's interested in hearing you whine, lady. I think you'd better turn around and forget this place exists." Evelyn kept smiling, but stepped closer, now near enough that only he could hear what she said next. "I think you're going to open that door and let me in, and if you don't, in 10 seconds your right knee won't work anymore." The man blinked, confused, but before he could react, Evelyn moved. As swiftly as someone who had done this dozens of times before, she grabbed his wrist, twisting it at an impossible angle while her right leg slid behind his knee. In a single motion, the bouncer fell to his knees with a groan, his cigarette slipping from his fingers. She gripped his face in her firm hand, pressing her thumb against a sensitive spot near his jaw. "Open the door." The man, sweating cold, nodded rapidly. Inside the Rusty Nail, the smell of cheap beer and cigarette smoke hung in the air. The bar was small and dimly lit, its walls lined with dark wood. A few rough-looking figures occupied the tables, men with dangerous eyes who cast curious glances at the woman who had just entered, but Evelyn didn't care about them. Her focus was on the man seated in the back, legs stretched over a table, laughing at something one of his goons had said. Troy Mitchell. He lifted his gaze, and his smile faded as he recognized her. Surprise was brief, but Evelyn caught it. He hadn't expected to see her there. That was a good sign. "Well, look who's here," he said, removing his feet from the table and leaning forward. "If it ain't the widow from the grocery store, you come to apologize for not leaving more money in the till." Evelyn walked up to the table, her eyes locked on him. When she reached it, she grabbed a whiskey bottle sitting there and slowly poured its contents onto the floor, unhurried, without looking away from Troy. The entire bar went silent. "You made a mistake, Troy, and I'm here to make sure you never make another." The air grew heavy. Troy didn't laugh this time. Silence in the Rusty Nail was as dense as the smoke hanging in the air. Evelyn Carter remained firm before Troy Mad Dog Mitchell, studying his every reaction with the precision of someone who had interrogated men far more dangerous than that cheap thug. The bitter smell of spilled whiskey on the floor mingled with the aroma of burned tobacco and stale sweat, creating a suffocating atmosphere. She didn't mind. Her focus remained only on Troy and what would happen next. The henchmen around. The bar still tried to process what was happening. Most of them didn't know how to react to the sight of a 62-year-old woman marching into their lair and challenging the leader without blinking. Evelyn recognized the exchanged looks, ate the tense muscles, the restless hands near their belts. They were waiting for a command but hesitated. That meant Troy hadn't fully earned their loyalty yet. Such weakness was an advantage. Troy, in turn, slowly reclined in his chair, trying to regain control of the situation. He wasn't stupid. What was this woman doing here, alone? Staring him down as an equal. Could she have protection? Was she a trap for the police? Or had he really crossed the wrong person? "You've got guts, old lady." He finally broke the silence with a crooked smile, but his tone didn't carry the same confidence as before. Evelyn leaned over the table, reducing the distance between them. Her gaze was a warning, a sharp blade ready to slit the throat of anyone who came too close. "I'm a patient woman, Troy, but don't confuse patience with weakness. You came into my town, destroyed my store, and thought you could walk away. That ends today." Her words hung in the air like an unspoken threat. Troy drummed his fingers on the table, still studying her, trying to figure out if it was all an elaborate joke or the start of a nightmare. Then he laughed, but it was not genuine. It was a nervous reflex, an attempt to reclaim the upper hand. "You think you can walk in here and order me around? I own this town now, lady, and if I want, you'll disappear before sunset." Evelyn smiled. She had heard those words before, from men far more dangerous than Troy, and she knew exactly what would come next. Before he could react, she moved like lightning, grabbing the knife stuck in the table and pressing the cold blade against his throat. The speed of her movement made everyone in the room freeze. Evelyn kept her face serene, as if she had all the time in the world. "If I wanted, you'd already be bleeding out on this table." Troy didn't move. His breathing grew heavier, and for the first time that night, he really saw Evelyn Carter, not as a widow, not as a store owner, but as something much, much worse. She was a ghost of the past, something he didn't fully understand but knew was dangerous. "I'm not asking again, Troy. Who sent you here?" The bar remained in absolute silence, except for the ticking of a wall clock marking the seconds. Tick, tock, tick, tock. Troy swallowed hard, the blade's reflection glinting in his confused gaze. He realized Evelyn wasn't just an angry lady defending her store. She was a real threat. His tone changed, lower, more controlled. I just take orders. I'm not the one pulling the strings." Evelyn narrowed her eyes. She already knew that Troy wasn't smart enough to plan something that big on his own. "Who? Troy?" Her voice was calm, but there was something in it that made the gang leader flinch. He hesitated, considered lying, stalling, but something in the way Evelyn held that knife, in the way her gaze seemed to cut through him like an invisible blade, made him reconsider. "Daniel." "Knox?" Evelyn showed no surprise, but internally her instincts flared to maximum alert. The name wasn't new. Knox was a former army officer who had disappeared years ago and now operated from the shadows, smuggling weapons and recruiting rogue soldiers. If he was involved in Fairview, it meant the town was about to turn into a battlefield. She pulled the knife away from Troy's neck and stood, adjusting her shirt sleeve as if nothing had happened. "You made your choice working for him, Troy. Now I'm making mine." She turned to leave, and in that instant, Troy's men finally reacted, moving toward her. But before any of them could take a step, she pulled a small device from her pocket and pressed a button. Outside, Troy's pickup truck exploded in a fireball. The shockwave shook the bar, rattling windows and throwing flames against the dark sky. Men jumped from their chairs, cursing and running to see what happened. Evelyn simply kept walking toward the door, her stride firm and steady. Before stepping out, she cast one last glance at Troy, who still sat pale and motionless. "That "I was just a warning. Next time it won't be your truck." Then she disappeared into the night, leaving behind a bar in chaos and a man who now knew, without a shadow of doubt, that he had messed with the wrong woman. As she drove home, Evelyn felt the cold thrill of combat pulsing in her veins. Knox. The name echoed in her mind like a distant reminder of a past she never wanted to relive. He was more than an ordinary criminal. He was a strategist, a man who used gangs like Troy as mere pawns on his warboard. If Knox was operating in Fairview, something much bigger was going on. Evelyn intended to find out exactly what. She checked the dashboard clock. 2:17 a.m. There was still time to prepare her next move. The cat-and-mouse game had begun, and she never lost a hunt. The explosion of Troy Mitchell's pickup truck still echoed through the dark alleys. Old Fairview like thunder announcing the inevitable. Evelyn Carter drove her old Chevy Silverado along a dirt road on the outskirts of town, hands firm on the wheel, eyes flicking to the rearview mirror. She didn't need a second look to know that night had sealed her fate. She was no longer just a widow running a grocery store. She was a hunter, and her prey had finally revealed a name, Daniel Knox. That name carried weight, not just for what it meant to the underworld, but for what it meant to her. Evelyn didn't like to admit it, but Knox had crossed her path before. He wasn't just a renegade ex-soldier, he was a strategist, a man who knew how to operate on the edge of chaos and order. Evelyn vaguely remembered the last time his name popped up in a mission, an undercover operation. Back then, Knox still wore a uniform and swore allegiance to the US government, but something changed over the years. He went from soldier to mercenary, then from mercenary to ghost, a name that appeared in classified files, always, linked to arms trafficking and military deserters. If he was in Fairview, it wasn't by chance. Evelyn also wasn't the same. She slightly pressed the accelerator, feeling the weight of time on her shoulders. 2 decades ago, she would have entered that bar with an elite squad and turned the place to ashes before Knox even realized she was there. Now she was alone, but alone was enough. She pulled up her truck half a mile away from the address Frank Delaney had mentioned, hiding it between 2 rusty old rigs. She stepped out into the silence, adjusting the Sig Sauer holster under her jacket and the combat knife strapped to her calf. Her every movement was meticulous, rehearsed. There was no room for mistakes. She advanced through the rocky terrain, moving smoothly as a predator used to hostile territory. Her body no longer had the speed of youth, but her experience made up for every limitation. Step by step, she approached the old warehouse on the outskirts of town, crouching beside a pile of scrap metal to get a better view. The building was huge, an old metal structure with grimy windows and a roof dented by time, but what really caught her attention was what lay around it. At least 8 armed men patrolled the perimeter, with 2 perched on the roof with sniper rifles. Near the main entrance, 3 modified trucks were parked, loaded with crates Evelyn immediately recognized. Military supplies. It confirmed Frank's suspicions. Knox wasn't just trafficking arms, he was arming a private militia. The warehouse's double doors opened, revealing a tall, stocky figure with military posture. Daniel Knox. Even from a distance, Evelyn recognized him by his gait, by the way he scanned his surroundings. He wasn't just any criminal, he was a former soldier, a man who understood strategy and could anticipate threats. She watched as Knox briefly spoke to one of his subordinates before going back inside. Her time was limited. She needed to infiltrate and discover exactly what was happening before it was too late. Evelyn took a deep breath and formed a plan. First, she had to take out the eyes above. The snipers on the roof were the biggest threat. If they were alerted, Knox would have time to react. She moved through the shadows to the side of the building, where an old ventilation duct rose to the rooftop. In a controlled effort, she gripped its rusted edges and started climbing. Her arms trembled slightly with exertion, but she ignored the pain. Years of training taught her body to obey, not complain. Upon reaching the top, she peered from behind a metal chimney. The first sniper was only a few feet away, holding a precision rifle and watching the road. He didn't see her coming. Without hesitation, Evelyn moved in and pulled out her knife, slashing his throat in one swift, fluid motion. The body fell silently. The second sniper sensed something was wrong and turned around, but Evelyn was already on him. She drove the blade under his armpit before he could shout, pushing him to the ground and covering his mouth until the spasms ceased. 2 down. Now it was Knox's turn. She descended the other side of the building and found a side entrance. The door was unlocked, a rookie mistake. Knox trusted his men so much he never considered the possibility of someone entering undetected. Inside the warehouse, Evelyn moved like a shadow between rows of crates filled with weapons and ammunition. The space was vast, lit by hanging fluorescent lamps. Further in, she heard voices. "The shipment has to be ready to go by tomorrow," Knox's voice echoed in the metal building. "If we don't meet the deadline, the buyers will look elsewhere." Evelyn peeked through a gap in the crates and saw Knox standing beside a table strewn with documents and maps. He was surrounded by 3 armed men. She gripped her pistol. She had only a few seconds before being noticed. With lethal precision, she fired 3 silenced shots. 2 of the henchmen fell before they realized what was happening. The third tried to draw his weapon, but Evelyn was already on him, snapping his wrist with a swift strike before shooting him in the chest. Knox stepped back, his expression shifting from shock to recognition. He finally saw who stood before him. "Carter," he said, his voice tinged with surprise and respect. "So it was you." Evelyn raised her gun, aiming at the center of his chest. "You should have stayed in the desert, Knox. Now I'll make sure you never crawl out of a hole again." "Knox, but you know as well as I do we're not leaving here without a show." Before she could reply, he moved his hand quickly toward a button under the table. The warehouse lights went out, and then all hell broke loose. Darkness filled every corner of the warehouse like a heavy cloak. Evelyn Carter kept her feet firmly on the cold concrete floor, her body immediately adjusting to the lack of light. Darkness was no disadvantage to her. It was an old ally. For years, her life was guided by shadows. And now, more than ever, that instinct returned as if it had never left. The metallic echo of the lamps going out was followed by tense silence. Knox did nothing by chance. He wasn't unarmed. He wasn't alone. The metallic click of a rifle being unlocked sounded close, but Evelyn was already moving before any shot could be fired. She dove behind a stack of crates, calculating Knox's position and any remaining survivors from the previous firefight. The next few seconds tested her patience. Neither wanted to reveal themselves first. Evelyn breathed slowly, her Sig Sauer steady in her hand. She could sense Knox's presence in the warehouse, but he was an experienced soldier and knew how to hide his steps. Every sound, every wrong move could be her last. "I wondered who might be hunting me," Knox's voice echoed in the darkness, calm, unhurried. "But when I saw you, Carter, it was like seeing a ghost." Evelyn didn't reply. She had learned the difference between speaking and listening, and right now she was listening for his location. Knox kept talking, his voice shifting to the left, a trick. "What I wonder," he continued, "is what brought you out of retirement? Pride, anger, or can't you stand being out of the fight?" Evelyn smiled slightly. His psychological game was predictable. Knox was trying to distract her, rattle her, but he had forgotten who he was dealing with. She picked up an empty cartridge from the floor and tossed it in the opposite direction, the sound reverberating against the metal walls. The bait worked. Knox fired quickly, blowing a stack of wood where she should have been. Now she had his position. Evelyn rose swiftly, firing 2 carefully placed shots. The first hit a generator at the back, causing a short circuit and sending sparks flying. The second grazed Knox's shoulder, forcing him to retreat behind a cluster of metal barrels. "You're slowing down, Carter," he taunted, though she sensed a tremor in his breathing. She had come close. The generator's residual electricity flickered weakly, casting unstable shadows on the walls. Evelyn moved among the crates, keeping a low profile. Age had taken some of her speed, but not her cunning. Knox was strong and fast, but he had a blind spot. He trusted too much in his own control. She advanced without a sound, her feet methodically placed. Knox thought she was still far away, but Evelyn was already less than 10 meters from him. "You know what I think?" She finally spoke, her voice firm, slicing the air. Knox turned sideways, raising his weapon. Too late. She was on him. Her forearm struck his wrist, redirecting the rifle away. He tried to land a direct punch, but she was already rotating, dodging and shoving him against a crate. His gun hit the floor with a metallic clank. They fought hand to hand. He was bigger, stronger, but Evelyn was more efficient. Each of her moves had a purpose. No wasted energy, no hesitation. An elbow to the ribs, a swift kick to the knee, a sharp blow to the throat. Knox staggered back, choking, eyes wide. He never expected the grocery store widow to be capable of that. "You shouldn't be alive," he gasped, clutching his neck. Evelyn pointed her gun at him, her finger tight on the trigger. "But I am—" For a second, the tension was suffocating. Knox knew he'd lost. He looked around for an escape, but there was nowhere to run. Evelyn didn't blink. Her eyes were the same as years ago, the eyes of a woman who knew when a man didn't deserve to breathe anymore. "So, Carter, what's it going to be?" He smiled thinly, blood trickling down his lip. Evelyn didn't hesitate. She fired. The bullet hit Knox's shoulder, sending him to his knees with a muffled scream. She wasn't going to kill him. Not yet. She crouched beside him, gripping his bloody collar. "You're going to tell me everything." Her voice was cold. "As steel, nah. Who else is involved, who the buyers are, and why the hell you brought this filth to my town?" Knox spat blood on the floor, panting. He knew his only chance of leaving alive was, and if he was involved, then Fairview was more than just a passing stop for Knox. It was something far bigger. Evelyn closed her eyes for a brief moment, letting the new piece of the puzzle sink in. Things had just gotten a lot more complicated. But there was one thing Evelyn Carter knew how to do well: solve problems. She pressed the gun to Knox's forehead and whispered, "Tell me everything you know, or I'll finish what I started." The night wasn't over, and the hunt was far from finished. Darren Cole's name lingered in the air like a slow, corrosive poison. Evelyn Carter did not immediately react, but inside, every alarm she possessed rang at once. She kept her pistol firmly pressed to Daniel Knox's bloody forehead, yet her mind was far beyond that dark, grimy warehouse. She knew Cole. She knew what he was capable of. And if that man had emerged from oblivion, it meant hell was about to be unleashed on Fairview. Knox breathed heavily, his body tense from the bullet wound in his shoulder. Blood stained his shirt, trickling onto the cold concrete floor, but he still managed to smile. It wasn't a smile of victory. It was the smile of a man who knew he had just played a card that changed everything. "I saw how that name rattled you, Carter," he wheezed. "Interesting, isn't it? Been a long time, right? Bet you thought he was dead." Evelyn gave no visible reaction. There was no room for shock or vulnerability. She pressed the gun barrel harder against his sweat-soaked skin, her voice icily calm. "Talk now." Knox let out a weak laugh, coughing soon after. He blinked a few times, forcing his blurred vision to focus on the woman standing over him, the woman who would haunt him for the rest of his life. "You don't get it, do you?" he said. "I'm not the real villain here, Carter. I'm just the messenger, the middleman. Darren Cole is behind everything: Fairview, the arms trade, corruption inside the local police." Evelyn remained expressionless, but every word cut through her mind like a sharp blade. She already had her suspicions. Now she just needed confirmation. What's the real plan? Knox tilted his head back, panting. The mix of sweat and blood made his skin shine in the flickering light. "Fairview is at the center of something much bigger, Carter. Cole is setting up a deal, but not just any deal." Evelyn frowned slightly. "Explain." Knox grinned, reveling in the brief moment of doubt. She didn't know. In that second, he realized that despite all her experience, Evelyn didn't have the full picture. "What did you see here? Crates of weapons? Mercenaries?" "That's just the surface. Cole is organizing an exclusive sale. He's gotten access to stolen military technology, prototypes the Pentagon doesn't even fully control, and he wants to sell them to whoever pays most." Evelyn's mind raced. She had spent years tracking arms dealers and criminals profiting from destruction, but this was on a completely different level. "When and where?" Knox coughed again, blood pooling at the corner of his lips. He knew his chances of surviving the night were slim. But if he was going to die, he'd make sure Evelyn carried this burden. "The auction is in 48 hours. A quiet place, away from prying eyes," he sneered. "Happening right in your territory, Carter, in your precious Fairview." She showed no reaction, but inside she felt anger simmer beneath her skin. "Where exactly?" Knox chuckled weakly. She still wanted answers, but some answers only came with sacrifice. "You'll have to find out yourself." Evelyn's patience ran out. She grabbed Knox by the collar and pulled him close, her words a sharp whisper. "I've let you live too long already, Knox. Tell me where, or I'll make sure you never speak again." This time his gaze faltered. He knew she wasn't bluffing. Finally, he caved. "The auction will be at the River's Edge Casino, in the basement. Cole turned the old foundation tunnels into a fortress. You'll never get in alone, and if you do, you'll never get out." Evelyn stood motionless for a moment, memorizing every detail. The River's Edge. She knew the place. A discreet casino run by an apparently respectable businessman, but always involved in shady dealings. If Cole had chosen that place, it meant everything was carefully arranged. The clock was ticking, and she had only 48 hours to stop something that could change the underworld's entire balance. She let go of Knox, who collapsed backward, gasping and trying to catch his breath. "So what happens now? Are you gonna kill me?" he asked, still grinning through bloody teeth. "He'll wish I were." As dawn crept over Fairview, Evelyn drove back into town. The place she once considered her refuge was now becoming a battlefield. Darren Cole wasn't just a criminal, he was an architect of chaos, a man who saw no boundary between morality and profit, and now he was bringing war to her door. She picked up her phone and dialed a number. Frank Delaney answered almost immediately. "Tell me you have something, Evie." "I have more than something, Frank. I have a name." Silence lingered on the line. "Tell me it's not who I'm thinking." Evelyn gripped the steering wheel, her eyes locked on the road. "Darren Cole. He's alive, and in 48 hours. He's going to sell something that could bring this country to its knees." Frank cursed under his breath. "This is bad, Evie, really bad. I know. That's why I need everything you can get on the River's Edge Casino. If Cole's there, that's where I'll finish this." Another tense silence. Then Frank inhaled deeply. "I'll see what I can do, but listen carefully, Evie. If you go in alone, you're walking into a death trap." Evelyn gave a thin smile, her voice low and razor-sharp. "Then I just have to turn the trap into an execution." She hung up. The rules of the game had changed. Evelyn Carter was no longer just a widow defending her town. She was Darren Cole's death sentence. Night was slowly dissolving. In the horizon, when Evelyn Carter crossed the Fairview limits, her gaze fixed on the empty road ahead, the neon glow of the River's Edge Casino was already visible in the distance, reflecting off the windshield of her old Chevy Silverado. The town still slept, but she knew that under that veneer of peace, something huge was underway. Inside that building, in the corridors hidden below the slot machines and the fancy halls, Darren Cole was about to sell something that could destabilize an entire nation. His name echoed in Evelyn's mind, reopening wounds she thought long buried. Darren Cole was no ordinary criminal. He wasn't a petty gangster climbing the ranks or a desperate dealer looking to make quick cash. He was an architect, a strategist capable of creating entire webs of corruption and destruction without ever getting his hands dirty. Back when she worked for the CIA, he was a phantom in the classified files. Now, he had stepped out of the shadows. But Evelyn was not the same either. She gently pressed the gas pedal, feeling the weight of time on her shoulders. 2 decades earlier, she would have stormed that casino with an elite team, reducing the place to rubble before Cole even realized she was there. Now, she was alone. But she only needed herself. She drove past the casino's main entrance. That wasn't her point of entry. The River's Edge was built decades ago on the foundation of an old distillery from Prohibition days. There were tunnels beneath the structure, secret passages once used for smuggling. If Cole was as smart as she knew he would use that space to conduct his discreet auction, away from prying eyes. Parking her truck in a side alley, she switched off the headlights before stepping out. Her moves were quick, silent. She wore dark clothing, Light enough for agility, but tough, enough for cuts and impacts. Her Sig Sauer was in a holster under her jacket, a tactical knife strapped to her thigh. No explosives, no backup. If it were up to Evelyn Carter, Darren Cole's destruction would be far more personal. Moving through the shadows, she found the entrance to the tunnels where she expected. A discreet hatch, half hidden by debris and metal plates. She tested the lock and found it sealed with a rusty chain, nothing that a pair of bolt cutters and a few seconds of patience couldn't fix. Once she removed the obstacle, she opened the hatch and descended. The smell was the first clue that the place hadn't been empty for some time. The air was thick with damp rust, but also gunpowder and gun oil. Dim lights flickered along the narrow corridor, confirming it was actively in use. She moved cautiously. Each step was calculated. Each shadow analyzed. The tunnel's old structure, with crumbling brick and steel beams, still held. In a few yards, it forked in two directions. Evelyn paused, listening. Footsteps. 2 men, maybe 3, talking quietly by the entrance to the right. She slid to the side, pressing against the wall. She waited for the right moment. As the first silhouette appeared around the bend, she attacked. With precision, she wrenched the guard's arm, pinning him with her weight and slamming him into the wall. The second man tried to draw his weapon, but she was already lunging at him, plunging her knife between his ribs. The third hesitated too long. Evelyn fired a silenced shot to his knee, sending him to the ground with a muffled scream. Kneeling next to him, "Where's Darren Cole?" Her voice was low and cold. "No hurry, no hesitation." He gasped, clutching his injured leg, eyes wide with pain and fear. Main hall, end of the tunnel," he managed, "but you won't make it. They're expecting someone." Evelyn gave a thin smile. "Then I just have to be faster than they are." She struck him at the side of the neck, knocking him out, then stood and continued through the corridor. The tunnel's main hall was a wide space, brightly lit by fluorescent lamps hanging from the low ceiling. A long table stood in the center, where 5 men in immaculate suits discussed documents and open weapon crates. Armed guards lined the walls, on alert for any strange movement. But Evelyn only saw one person, Darren Cole. He stood at the center of negotiations, wearing a dark blue suit jacket over an open-collar shirt. His gray hair was perfectly combed, and he bore the same meticulous smile she remembered from so many years ago. He looked comfortable, confident, but that would soon change. Evelyn didn't bother hiding. She simply walked into the hall. The first guard spotted her, raising his gun, but before he could shoot, she fired first. The silenced round took him in the chest, sending him back. Chaos erupted in the hall. Foreign buyers scrambled for cover. The guards drew weapons. But Cole only smiled. Well, if it isn't Evelyn Carter," he said, stepping back from the table. "I wondered when you would show up." Evelyn said nothing, aiming her weapon at him. "It's over, Cole." His smile broadened. "Is it?" That's when she realized. A metallic click reverberated through the tunnel. Traps. Before Evelyn could react, a jolt of electricity surged through her body, knocking her to the floor, a remote-triggered charge coming from the metal floor. Her body convulsed, the pistol slipping from her grasp. She struggled to regain control, but it was too late. Guards rushed in, kicking her gun away, hauling her up by the arms. She was still stunned, too weak to fight back. Darren Cole walked over slowly, bending down to meet her gaze. His eyes were cold, calculating. "I have to say I'm impressed, Carter, but not impressed enough." He gripped her chin between his fingers, forcing her to look at him. "This time, you lose." Rage boiled within her, but at that moment, there was nothing she could do. The hunter had become the prey. The metallic taste of blood mixed with the dryness in Evelyn Carter's mouth as she blinked, trying to clear the haze that blurred her vision. The electric jolt that brought her down still left waves of pain along her nerves, but her mind was adapting quickly. She'd been through worse. The question now was, what next? Darren Cole still stood there, looming over her like a judge ready to condemn someone to death. The years had not changed him. His gaze was still loaded with a cold, calculated sadism. He never killed quickly. He liked savoring his sense of control. Evelyn knew that because she'd hunted men like him before. The difference was that, until now, she'd never been the prey. Cole's laughter echoed through the tunnel. He wanted everyone present to witness his victory, the foreign buyers, the hired mercenaries, the heavily armed thugs. A spectacle. "So isn't the infamous Agent Carter," he said, clapping slowly, theatrically. "I'll admit I'm impressed. Reaching this far was quite an achievement. But as you can see, it's over." Evelyn didn't respond. She knew when to speak and when to listen. There was information to glean here. Cole stepped back and gestured to two men in dark suits. They approached and hoisted her up by the arms, forcing her to kneel. Her body was still weak from the shock, but her mind was fully engaged. Her eyes scanned the environment, mapping every variable. 9 armed men, 2 behind her, 1 to the left, 1 near the tunnel entrance, and 5 more spaced out, in strategic positions. Cole was the real problem. He wasn't holding a weapon, but Evelyn knew his greatest weapon was always his mind. He bent slightly, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "I've seen your name in so many old. A report's yours, Carter. Every time I tried expanding my reach, there you were, like a phantom. And now look at you." She kept her gaze steady, unblinking. "If I'm a phantom, Cole, then you're already dead and don't realize it." His smile flickered for just a second before returning. She'd planted a seed of doubt. "You know what I like about you, Carter. You never give up. So now, you're going to learn the difference between perseverance and stupidity." He stood up, turning to face the foreign. "But as you can see, the future belongs to us." The group muttered in agreement. One man, Serbian-looking, wearing a neatly tailored grey suit, crossed his arms, studying Evelyn with curiosity. "What will you do with her?" he asked. Cole smiled, grabbing a glass of whiskey from a nearby table. He took a sip, savoring it before answering. "That depends. I could kill her now and be done with it. But I have a better idea." Evelyn already knew what he was going to say before the words left his mouth. "I'll sell her." Silence filled the tunnel for a moment, then soft laughter among the onlookers. Cole's game was cruel. He didn't just want to defeat her, he wanted to erase her, turn her into an object, a commodity. But Evelyn Carter was never a commodity. She used the guard's distraction to strike. Her head snapped backward, slamming into the nose of the guard on her right. He groaned, losing his grip on her arm. In the same instant, Evelyn twisted the other guard's wrist and spun her body in a sharp, practiced move. The guard's pistol slid from its holster into her hands, 2 precise shots. They fell before they could react. Panic erupted in the tunnel. Cole stumbled back, stunned. "Shoot her!" he shouted, retreating behind the table. But Evelyn was already moving. She dove behind a stack of crates, dodging the first barrage of bullets. Her body was still weak, but her aim was immaculate. She fired 3 more shots. Each one found its target. The foreign buyers ran, ducking for cover, as the mercenaries tried to gain control. The tunnel was a war zone. Evelyn rolled to the side, picking up a fallen knife. She needed more cover. In one swift motion, she hurled the blade at one of the overhead fluorescent lights. The glass shattered, sending sparks and plunging half the tunnel into darkness. She moved through the shadow like a ghost. One guard ran by, seeking a better vantage point. Evelyn intercepted him with a strike to the neck, stealing his weapon before he hit the ground. Only 3 were left. Cole looked around, desperation flashing across his face. He no longer had control. "Carter, you can't win this alone," he called out, trying to regain the upper hand. She appeared behind him, pressing the gun to his head. "Who said I'm alone?" That's when he noticed footsteps echoed down the tunnel. Frank Delaney and a group of agents stormed in, guns raised. Frank's voice boomed, "Looks like your party's over, Cole." Darren Cole clenched. His teeth. He had lost. Evelyn kept the gun against the back of his head for another second, adrenaline surging through her veins. She could end this right there, but no. Cole had to pay. He had to be taken alive so everyone would see him fall. She lowered the gun and shoved him forward. "Get up, Cole. The show's over." The agents moved in, quickly cuffing him. The tunnel still smelled of gunpowder and blood, but the auction was shut down. Evelyn exhaled slowly. The war was over, or at least that part of it.
Hi, I'm Mark Bianco, the writer and narrator of most of the stories you see here on the channel. I've handpicked 2 incredible stories for you to watch next. They're right here on the left side of your screen. Click and enjoy! Oh, and if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss tomorrow's story about veterans and law enforcement officers who help make our country what it is. See you in the next tale.